The Battle of the Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, stands as one of the most iconic and debated military engagements in American history. Taking place on June 25 to 26, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana, this battle involved the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the U.S. Army, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, and an alliance of Native American tribes, primarily the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho. These tribes, under the leadership of prominent figures such as Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall, decisively defeated Custer's forces in a confrontation that came to symbolize Native American resistance to U.S. expansion. The battle, while tactically a victory for the Native Americans, ultimately accelerated the government's aggressive policies toward the Plains Indians, leading to their defeat and forced relocation to reservations. Let's examine the causes, events, and consequences of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as well as its broader historical significance. In the mid-19th century, the United States was driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was divinely ordained to expand across North America. This expansion, however, brought the U.S. government into conflict with the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, who had long inhabited the region. Plains tribes, such as the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne, lived a nomadic lifestyle, relying heavily on the buffalo herds that roamed the area. As American settlers moved westward, the government increasingly sought to confine Native American tribes to reservations, which would make way for white settlers, railroads, and economic development. A key moment in this conflict was the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, in which the U.S. government recognized the Black Hills of South Dakota as part of the Great Sioux Reservation and guaranteed the land to the Lakota people. However, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills in 1874, during an expedition led by George Armstrong Custer, the U.S. government reneged on the treaty. The ensuing influx of miners into the region led to rising tensions and inevitable conflict between the Sioux and the U.S. Army. By 1876, many Native Americans had grown increasingly resentful of U.S. encroachment on their lands. Among the most influential leaders of the resistance were Sitting Bull, a Lakota Sioux chief, and Crazy Horse, a revered warrior. Sitting Bull, in particular, played a key role in rallying the Plains tribes against the U.S. government, orchestrating a large gathering of warriors at a summer encampment along the Little Bighorn River. Sitting Bull's vision, during a Sundance ceremony, foretold of a great victory against the U.S. forces, further galvanizing the tribes in their fight. The U.S. government, frustrated by the failure of some Native groups to move on to reservations as mandated, sent military expeditions to force them into submission. One of these expeditions was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer, a bold and controversial officer known for his aggressive tactics. Custer, who had distinguished himself during the Civil War, was tasked with leading part of the campaign to subdue the Native American forces gathered along the Little Bighorn River. In the spring of 1876, 3 separate U.S. Army columns were dispatched to converge on Native American forces in southeastern Montana. These columns were commanded by Generals Alfred Terry, George Crook, and John Gibbon. The plan was to corner the Native warriors and force their surrender or compliance with government orders to return to reservations. However, a series of miscalculations and communication failures plagued the U.S. campaign from the outset. General Crook, leading one of the columns, was engaged by a large force of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors on June 17, 1876, in what became known as the Battle of the Rosebud. Although the engagement was inconclusive, Crook's forces were effectively neutralized and were unable to participate in the subsequent battle at Little Bighorn. General Terry, leading another column, ordered Custer and the 7th Cavalry to scout ahead and locate the Native American encampment. Custer was given discretion in how to proceed, but his decision-making would prove disastrous. Underestimating the size and strength of the native force, Custer chose to divide his regiment into 3 battalions, a move that spread his forces too thin in the face of overwhelming opposition. Custer's decision to split his forces has been the subject of much historical debate. He divided his command into 3 parts, one led by Major Marcus Reno another by Captain Frederick Benteen, and a third under his personal command, which would strike the main native camp. Custer believed this strategy would enable him to encircle the native forces and prevent their escape. However, this decision left each segment of his command isolated. Custer's approach was further hindered by a lack of accurate intelligence. He underestimated the size of the native encampment and was unaware of the scale of the resistance he would face. He also made the fatal assumption that native forces would attempt to flee rather than stand and fight, a misjudgment that would cost him dearly. The battle began in earnest on the afternoon of June 25, 1876, when Major Reno, following Custer's orders, led a detachment of 140 men in a direct assault on the southern end of the native encampment. Reno's men crossed the river and attacked, but they quickly encountered fierce resistance from Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, who overwhelmed the soldiers. Reno's forces were soon forced to retreat into nearby woods, where they formed a defensive perimeter. Under heavy fire, Reno's troops eventually fled to high ground, later known as Reno Hill, where they joined forces with Benteen's contingent. Reno's attack, meant to be a diversion, had failed spectacularly, and his men were now pinned down and cut off from Custer's battalion. While Reno and Benteen's forces struggled to hold their position, Custer led his battalion of 210 men in a direct assault on the main native encampment. Custer's plan was to strike the camp from the north, but he quickly found himself surrounded by hundreds of native warriors. The exact details of Custer's final moments remain unclear, as no survivors from his immediate command lived to tell the tale. But it is believed that Custer's forces were overwhelmed in a matter of hours. The warriors, led by figures such as Crazy Horse and Gall, attacked Custer's position from all sides. Custer's men fought valiantly, but were eventually overrun. The battle concluded with the complete annihilation of Custer's battalion, in what became famously known as Custer's Last Stand. The bodies of Custer and his men were found scattered across the battlefield, their positions indicating a desperate, last-ditch defense. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a stunning and decisive victory for the Native American forces. However, the triumph was short-lived. The U.S. government, shocked by Custer's defeat, responded with a renewed military campaign that ultimately crushed the native resistance. The victory at Little Bighorn served to intensify the resolve of the U.S. military and government to bring the Plains tribes under control. In the months following the battle, the U.S. Army launched a relentless campaign against the Sioux, Cheyenne, and other tribes. By the end of 1876, most of the native forces had been forced onto reservations. Sitting Bull and his followers fled to Canada, but eventually returned to the U.S. and surrendered in 1881. Crazy Horse continued to resist until his capture and eventual death in 1877. The Battle of the Little Bighorn thus marked the beginning of the end for the traditional way of life of the Plains tribes. While they had achieved a rare victory against the U.S. Army, they were unable to sustain their resistance in the face of overwhelming military and economic pressure. By the late 1870s, the buffalo herds had been decimated, and the Plains tribes had been forced onto reservations, dependent on government rations and largely stripped of their autonomy. The Battle of the Little Bighorn also had a profound impact on American popular culture and national memory. George Armstrong Custer, who had been a polarizing figure in life, became a legendary and heroic figure in death. His last stand was mythologized in books, paintings, and popular culture, with Custer often portrayed as a gallant martyr who had fought bravely to the end. This narrative largely ignored the more controversial aspects of Custer's career, including his reckless ambition and the military blunders that contributed to his defeat. The portrayal of the Native American warriors who fought at Little Bighorn also shifted over time. Initially vilified in the American press, leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were later viewed with more sympathy as symbols of indigenous resistance to U.S. expansionism. The battle, once seen as a tragic defeat for the U.S. Army, came to be understood as a key moment in the larger story of the American West and the complex, often violent, interactions between Native Americans and European settlers. The Battle of the Little Bighorn holds enduring significance in the history of the American West. It was one of the few instances in which Native American forces decisively defeated a larger and better equipped U.S. military force. The battle exposed the deep divisions and misunderstandings between the U.S. government and the Plains tribes, whose way of life was irreversibly altered by the westward expansion of American settlers. The defeat of Custer and his men also had a lasting impact on U.S. military policy. The U.S. government redoubled its efforts to subdue the remaining Native resistance, culminating in the eventual defeat of the Lakota Sioux and their allies. In a broader sense, the battle signaled the end of the Plains Indian Wars and the beginning of a new era in American history, in which the vast territories of the West were brought under U.S. control and the indigenous peoples were relegated to the margins of society. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is remembered as one of the most dramatic and controversial episodes in the history of the American West. While it was a rare and significant victory for the Plains tribes, it ultimately hastened their defeat and the loss of their lands and way of life. The battle also left an indelible mark on American culture, with the myth of Custer's last stand becoming a powerful symbol of the broader struggle between the U.S. government and Native American resistance. In reflecting on the Battle of the Little Bighorn, it is essential to recognize its complexity and the multitude of perspectives involved. For the Native American warriors who fought at the Little Bighorn, it was a moment of profound defiance and bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. For the U.S. Army and the American public, it was a shocking and humiliating defeat that spurred a renewed campaign to conquer the West. Ultimately, the battle stands as a pivotal moment in the tragic history of the Plains tribes and their resistance to U.S. expansion, a story that continues to resonate in the broader narrative of American history.